Okay, so whenever I hear about Rasputin, it's always either about the song that was made about him or maybe potentially the weird way in which he died. But the more I research the guy, the more I think he might be one of the weirdest and most interesting characters of the 20th century. So Rasputin was born in 1869 in South Siberia. The area was deeply poor with a literacy rate of only 4%, and it was also very much religious, with the main religion being Eastern Christian Orthodox, a devout Christian sect that believed above all else in the divine will of God, meaning that miracles and holy men were taken very seriously. So Rasputin was religious from an early age, but he was not popular as a child. Rumour got out that he would wet the bed, which isolated him from his peers. One person that would play with him was his cousin. However, when they were both 8, Rasputin and the boy would fall in a river. They'd both develop pneumonia, and Rasputin would be the only one to survive, leaving him completely isolated from everyone else. This led to Rasputin spending a lot of time with horses, like potentially too much time for him to be spending with horses. But it did lead to him having some interesting skills that some of us might not even deem possible in this day and age. For instance, there's a story that when he was 12, Rasputin was lying feverish in his sickbed when 2 of his neighbours came in and asked his father if they knew anything about a stolen horse. Rasputin climbed out of his bed and went into the living room, where he pointed at one of the men. He would then proceed to accuse that man of being the one who stole the horse. Rasputin's dad was kind of embarrassed, so he ushered the sick boy back into his room and apologised to the people that had come to his house. But later that evening, the man that Rasputin accused was found trying to move the stolen horse. Rasputin had been correct about everything, and now everyone in the village was terrified about what else he might be correct about. And Rasputin was not just a horse whisperer. Over time, he developed another skill: his eyes. They were described by many as disturbing, alluring, and piercing like needles. His ability to fix his unblinking gaze on you, to look into your very being and make you feel either fully disarmed or completely off balance. It's also said that his manner of speaking was disjointed and fragmented, making it hard to follow and leading you to fall into a trance-like state in his presence. Okay, that's enough of that for now. It's getting a little bit weird, but long story short, Rasputin was a master of manipulation, communication, and people. He could read a room like no one else and was adept when it came to getting exactly what he wanted out of a situation. Rasputin would marry at 18, this seemingly having little effect on his, shall we say, busy love life. He'd eventually have 7 children with the woman, 3 of them living into adulthood. Rasputin had 2 favourite hobbies: drinking and talking about God. Well, he also had that busy love life, so should we say 3 hobbies. And that would be life for Rasputin until 28, almost a decade later, when he was accused of horse theft because, well, the only crime in Siberia, it seems, is horse theft. The evidence against Rasputin wasn't as strong as the evidence against his friends, meaning while they were completely exiled, he was offered just a temporary exile. However, Rasputin didn't want to take that, and he had other plans. Rasputin could have run off into the woods for a couple of months and then come back when everyone had forgotten about it. But instead, he had a different plan. He wanted to go on a holy pilgrimage to a monastery, a much more treacherous journey than he had to take, but one that would change his life and potentially the course of the 20th century forever. So when he returned home from the pilgrimage, Rasputin was sober, vegetarian, and willing to talk to anyone that would listen about God. He was seemingly a changed man, but still very much himself. He soon amassed a small group of people that would pray with him in his father's root cellar. And yes, it goes without saying at this point, he was having sex with some members of the congregation. But this wasn't enough for Rasputin. He wanted more power and more control, and he knew the only way to get that would be to go to Kazan. Now, Kazan was a 5-day walk up the Volga River, and in 1904, at the age of 35, Rasputin was set off on a journey that would lead him eventually all the way up to the emperor. So within a couple of months at the monastery, Rasputin had made a name for himself as a gifted healer. He'd also caught the attention of one Archimandrite Andrei. In fact, he even warned the Archimandrite that a fellow monk was going to attempt to murder him. When that monk did make the attempt on the Archimandrite's life, Rasputin was revered as magical, and his place in the monastic society was solidified. It would be at this time that the tales of a gifted starets, a holy man with piercing blue eyes, would emanate throughout Siberia. So Kazan was all well and good, but Rasputin knew if he wanted true power, he would need to be in St. Petersburg. And get to St. Petersburg he would do. Within a couple of months, he had a letter of recommendation from the Archimandrite sent to the bishop at the St. Petersburg seminary. This is what I love about the Rasputin story. Within a year, he's gone from being kicked out of his small, poor Siberian village for horse theft to getting an all expenses paid first-class trip to St. Petersburg on the church's dime. Once at the ceremony, Rasputin would endear himself to Archimandrite Theophan, who was well respected and connected within the aristocracy. This also granted Rasputin access to the St. Petersburg salons, where all the movers and shakers from around Russia would meet, drink, and discuss ideas. Many of the people of influence that Rasputin would mingle with here would later become his followers before eventually turning on him. Okay, just for a bit of context here, during the 20th century there was a massive wave of occult thought moving through the aristocracies in Europe. Many people were bored with the church and interested in the supernatural, and Russia was no different in this regard. So when Rasputin first walked into those salons, he would have been met with a room full of rich, powerful people, primed to believe anything he was willing to spout and listen to his bullshit. So two people he would meet in the salon are Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro. Commonly referred to as the Crow Sisters, these women were both very close to the imperial family and interested in the occult. In fact, they'd actually recommended the Tsarina her previous spiritual advisor, Dr. Philippe. Dr. Philippe had helped the Tsarina give birth to her first son and heir to the throne, and on his deathbed he would speak of a new holy man who would soon come into their lives to help them take care of her son. On the 1st of November 1905, Rasputin would meet Nicholas and Alexandra Romanov for the first time, the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, in a meeting that was only meant to go on for a short period of time and lasted several hours. Rasputin would find the fulcrum with which he's able to leverage the most power. Alexandra and Nicholas's son Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a disorder that would stop his blood from clotting if he were to be cut or have any internal bruising. This was not only incredibly life-threatening for him in this time, but also something that would put massive amounts of strain on the trust of the imperial family if it were to ever to be made public. Therefore, Alexei's haemophilia was a closely guarded secret, and something that not even his personal tutors would know about. Now, sources disagree on exactly how Rasputin learned of this. It might have been that the Crow Sisters told him, or it might have been that he worked it out through sheer intuition. But all that we know is by October 1906, Rasputin was being asked to come in whenever Alexei was sick to help alleviate his symptoms and bring him back to full health. And this is something that Rasputin is well documented in being able to do. He was actually able to help this boy with his disease. It's important to note that Nicholas was not in a great place as a ruler prior to meeting Rasputin. The decision to go into the 1904 Russo-Japanese War and try and expand east was a bad idea, to say the least. The only decision that was worse than that, in fact, was when he ordered the police to shoot on protesters who were protesting said war, killing over 100 people. So we're in 1905, and Rasputin is the first port of call whenever Alexei gets sick. And as he gets more comfortable in his role, he's slowly transitioning back into his more drunken, philanderous Rasputin ways. His actions, twinned with the fact that no one had a clue why Rasputin was so valuable to the royal family, led to a lot of rumour. And Rasputin did not care who he annoyed. He would often let people refer to him as a starets, which is an official holy man of the Russian Orthodox Church, although he was never officially ordained, so he never should have used that title. On top of that, he also now had a bit of a habit of, getting drunk and then claiming to be having a sexual relationship with the Tsarina of Russia, which was just a bit unseemly for a lot of people. This would all come to a head when letters from Alexandra to Rasputin would be found and published. They had some pretty scandalous snippets in, which led to the rumour mill going into absolute overdrive. And with that, Rasputin was sent home to Siberia. Not because any of the rumours were true, because I can assure you there was no sexual relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin, but because the letters were found. When you're sending letters to and back from the imperial family, you can't be leaving them out in a way that they could be found and potentially leaked. It's just not the done thing. And it was because of that mistake that Rasputin was sent home. So that's it. Rasputin had a few drinks, he met some women, he met the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia and had some good time messing around with them. Generally pissed off a lot of the aristocracy, and then he's back in Serbia. But didn't this all end with his death? And in the grand scheme of things, he hasn't really done anything yet apart from getting a bit pissed. So this is actually where the story gets really interesting. You see, the imperial family would often go on trips to Poland to unwind and get a bit of a break from it all. And it was on one of these trips, on a bumpy carriage ride on their way there, where Alexei would suffer from internal bruising, as well as a couple of bumps from playing around as any young child would. After multiple blood transfusions that had no effect, Alexei was very much on death's door. The imperial family, while watching their son die, had no choice but to call Rasputin. And it would be when they called him, he would drunkenly answer the phone and say, "Your son will live. Make sure he rests and don't let the doctors bother him too much." And with that, Alexei made a swift and very unexpected recovery. And after that moment, Rasputin would never leave the imperial family side again. So the exact way in which Rasputin was able to save Alexei is not known, although there are a couple of theories. The main one being about aspirin. You see, aspirin was a recently discovered drug that was being used as a cure-all at the time,
And while it does relieve pain, aspirin is also a blood thinner which would exacerbate the symptoms of haemophilia. It's very possible that Rasputin had figured this out and was able to save Alexei by simply not giving him aspirin or not letting the doctors bother him too much. I don't know if this was the only part of the puzzle. We do know that Rasputin was a very powerful hypnotist, and it has been shown in modern studies that haemophilia symptoms can actually be reduced by hypnotism sometimes. It's very possible that with his signature gaze, Rasputin was able to lower the blood pressure of Alexei and reduce his symptoms of haemophilia. So let's go back to Serbia. On the 12th of July 1914, around a month before Russia joined World War I, Rasputin would leave his family home at the dead of night and would see a woman outside looking at him. The woman was wearing a thin veil over her face and would walk up to Rasputin before lunging forward and stabbing a knife into his stomach. Exactly what happened in this interaction varies between sources, but it seems as if the group of people then lifted the woman off Rasputin, stopping her from finishing the job and killing him. For his troubles, Rasputin would spend 49 days in hospital, where large sections of his intestine would have to be removed. This would cause chronic pain that would last for the rest of his life. So the woman who did this to him? Well, she was referred to by most as the woman with no nose for obvious reasons, but Rasputin would only call her one thing for the rest of his life: the slut who shoved a knife up my ass. And that might just be the most Rasputin thing that I've read while researching this whole video. The first year of World War I did not go well for Russia. 1.5 million Russian lives were lost on the front lines, and the public opinion of the imperial family was at an all-time low. And it was at this point that Nicholas would make a grand decision, that he would fire the head commander and he'd leave the army himself. But Nicholas didn't have any military experience, and the only qualification he had was that his dad was previously the Tsar. This guy was not fit for the job in any way, and it was not a good decision to make. But it's okay, surely, because with Nicholas preoccupied with the war effort, he can pick someone who's actually qualified to run the country from St. Petersburg. And the person he picks is, well, his wife. And it doesn't go down well, not with the aristocracy and not with the public by any means. And this gets especially worse when we realise that the new de facto domestic leader of Russia, the wife of the old unqualified leader, now has the ear of a drunken tramp who, for some reason, is always with the imperial family. I'm going to be honest, the optics aren't exactly great. Now, this led to a really interesting chain of events, because Alexandra and Alexei were completely reliant on Rasputin at this point. And when it came to replacing anyone within the government, Alexandra had a choice. Does she pick someone who is pro or anti-Rasputin? Because she knew she couldn't get rid of Rasputin without the death of her son and heir to the throne, she had to pick someone who was pro-Rasputin. Not necessarily to give Rasputin any more power, because he wasn't necessarily looking for it, but because it's just easier to do that than to have someone who's going to ask loads of questions about this guy. So from an outsider's perspective, we have this haggard, old, drunken-looking man who seems to have the ear of the Tsarina, who is also having everyone in the government replaced with people who like him. It concerned a lot of people, to say the least. And what made it slightly worse was the people that liked Rasputin weren't necessarily the most professional people in the Russian aristocracy. You see, Rasputin liked outsiders. He was a weirdo and an outsider, and he liked to surround himself with similar people. A shining example of this was Alexander Protopopov, who in September 1916 was promoted to the Minister of the Interior of the Russian Empire. Protopopov had two things going for him. One, he suffered from advanced syphilis, which gave him neurological complications. And two, he'd got accustomed to the arising powders that he was given while he was getting treatment for said syphilis. In other words, Rasputin hired a mentally unstable coke addict as the Russian equivalent of the Home Secretary. At this point, Rasputin knew his time was almost up. The idea of killing Rasputin was so popular, it was talked about in newspapers around St. Petersburg. Certain people who were looking to conspire and help to kill Rasputin would go around and ask others for help. Sometimes when they would do so, the people they would ask would say, "We'd love to help you kill Rasputin, but we tried it a while ago and it didn't work." However, for every failed assassination attempt and dangerous situation that Rasputin would somehow bumble his way out of, there would be one that would finally get him. And that person would be Felix Yusupov. Just past midnight, on the 30th of December 1916, Prince Felix Yusupov would invite Rasputin round to his palace. Rasputin was led downstairs to the basement, where he found a selection of tea and cakes, all laced with enough cyanide to kill upwards of 10 people. Rasputin, being Rasputin, didn't want anything to do with tea and cakes, but did see some wine that was also laced with cyanide. Rasputin would continue to drink said wine for the next 2 hours, after a while getting peckish and eating a couple of the cakes as well. He would then see a guitar in the corner and ask Felix Yusupov to come over and play that guitar for him. Yusupov, having just watched a man consume enough cyanide to kill multiple people, was starting to lose his mind a bit and wondering why Rasputin just would not die. So he started playing for him, and as Rasputin drank more, he would slowly slip in and out of consciousness. Every time he did fall asleep, however, Yusupov was convinced that he was dead from all the poison that he consumed and would stop playing. But Rasputin kept waking up, and every time he did, he was confused as to why Yusupov had stopped playing and demanded that he restart again. Yusupov was losing his mind at this point. He had no idea why Rasputin just would not die. So he goes up to his co-conspirators upstairs, and they tell him to get himself together, and they hand him a gun to go and finish the job properly. So after all that, Yusupov goes downstairs, gun in hand, and as Rasputin is holding a crystal crucifix, shoots him in the chest. And just as an aside to remove some of the mysticism, cyanide actually kills you by reacting with your stomach acid, something that Rasputin had a lot less of since he had a large sector of his intestine removed. This could very well be the reason that Rasputin didn't suffer some of the more aggressive symptoms of cyanide poisoning, like death. But Yusupov and his co-conspirators had a plan, and it was a very good plan at that. They were going to go to Rasputin's apartment with a man dressed as Rasputin. They were then going to get seen taking that man into his apartment, and there's no way they could get caught with the crime because they were with Rasputin when he was alive. This plan, if you can't tell, was just really dumb in every way. It was just a bad plan. And after that really lazily attempted alibi, they went back to the palace with Yusupov, who was a complete mess at this point. Rasputin was very much in his head, and he was losing it. Yusupov was convinced that Rasputin would still be alive, even having been shot in the stomach. So he went down to the basement to check on him, and he found a really pissed off Rasputin. The guy still wasn't dead. He was alive, the poison hadn't killed him, and the shot had only really annoyed him. And with that, Rasputin stood up, pushed Yusupov over, and ran up the stairs. Rasputin would barely make it into the courtyard before he was shot in the back by one of Yusupov's co-conspirators. And with that, he was dead. That's how he died. He was shot in the back. It wasn't the poison, it wasn't the stabbing, it wasn't the other gunshot, it wasn't any of the other assassination attempts. He was just shot in the back. I'm not a historian, and I'm not here to try and convince you that Rasputin was the sole cause of the end of the imperial family. I don't believe that myself. But the fact that a poor man from an inconsequential part of Serbia was able to climb the ladder all the way to the top of the empire and lead to conversations we have debating what influence he had over how the whole 20th century played out is something that amazes me. He met people and did things that never would have been possible in Serbia, lived a life that most people would have thought would have been completely out of his reach. But through sheer determination and a lot of bullshit, let's not undermine the bullshit, there was a lot of bullshit there, he did it.